I come to you now with breaking news that the EU are preparing a military intervention into the Ukraine-Russia war with boots on the ground, planes in the air, and in fact they will be mobilizing their tanks just as soon as their Rainbow tanks have finished charging. I'm joking, of course, but then again, the idea that the EU can take on Russia without the help of the United States, well, it is a joke. My name's Topher Field, this is the Topher Project, and I help people like you to understand the world as it changes around us. And this whole Russia-Ukraine, now US and NATO at odds with each other situation is proving to be very revealing. But mostly what it's revealed is that most of the Western world have no concept of the benefit that they've had under the Pax Americana, no idea of just how vulnerable they are without Big Brother America there to help them, and are completely unprepared, not just militarily, but culturally, to fight a real war. And yes, I mentioned the Pax Americana. The last 80 years since the end of World War II have been historically among the most peaceful in all of history once you adjust for population size. Now, a lot of people get in the comments, this hasn't been a peaceful century. What about this war? What about that war? What about all the proxy wars and all the regime change? Yes, I know about all of those things. Do you have any idea just how violent the rest of human history really is? If you study geopolitical history, you are literally studying the history of wars and assassinations. That is basically what human history is. And the fact that the last 80 years has been defined by mostly proxy wars, where empires are fighting each other, but not directly, they're using some other battleground as their little chessboard to play on, and also by regime change, internal conflicts that are, yes, stirred up for geopolitical reasons. I'm not advocating it, by the way. I'm just saying that's a far cry from the total war type scenarios that have defined most other centuries before the last 80 years. We have lived under the Pax Americana. America have been the big boy on the block. They have been the bully, but they've chosen to use their power in ways that have actually kept us away from outright war rather than in it. And that is a historical anomaly and one that we should actually be grateful for. But far from being grateful, many countries are proving themselves to be completely ungrateful and to have lost all perspective on just how lucky they've been. But this situation unfolding with Ukraine is beginning to show the cracks in their ungratefulness. For a while now, it's been fashionable to call out the American World Police thing. And yes, it's a hilarious movie. I've watched it. It is very funny. If you haven't seen it, do yourself a favor. Very funny movie. But we call out Team America World Police and we say that they want to run around the world keeping us safe, spreading freedom. Oh, it's really just a war for oil. Well, yeah, that's largely true. But even so, we have benefited enormously from the Pax Americana, imperfect though it has been. And the EU recently just tried to pretend that they could go in and rescue Ukraine, that they could go in and supply Ukraine with military aid and financial aid in order for Ukraine to be able to win this current war against Russia. And it took just a matter of days for them to crumble and begin to admit the truth, which is they have no hope of doing such a thing unless the US joins them. This is because the US spends over $800 billion a year on defense, and the rest of NATO without the US, well, they spend about $400 billion, half. But that doesn't actually describe the scale of the problem that NATO has. Because America, when it wants to deploy its troops, they all have basically the same training, the same standard operating procedures, the same common language, and all of their interoperability and communications has been designed as a single fighting force to work together. The same isn't true to anywhere near the same degree in NATO. They have language barriers, they have equipment and non compatibility issues that the US simply doesn't have. But more than that, the US have a unique ability, thanks to their role as Team America World Police over the last 80 years, to project power, to provide military forces not only for the front line, but the depth of logistics that is required to keep that fighting force operating, to keep those tanks in operational condition, to repair them when they get damaged or when they break down, to supply the fuel, to supply the food, to supply the ammunition, to extract wounded soldiers, etc. The US have a unique global logistical capability that no one else can match. To illustrate that point, Australia embarrassingly about 6 months ago promised a couple of dozen tanks to Ukraine. We were going to physically send these M1A1 Abrams tanks over to Ukraine to aid them in the war effort. Put aside the fact that that's a really dumb idea to begin with, because no Ukrainian tank crews are trained on that hardware. That's not only do we need to send the tanks, we've got to actually train up all of the technicians to be able to service these things, repair them when they get broken. We need to completely retrain the tank crews on a tank that is designed and labeled in English, that has all of these systems and subsystems that are really quite sophisticated. They're an amazing piece of hardware, but you can't drop a tank crew trained for ex-Soviet Russian hardware into an M1A1 Abrams and expect them to be able to fight a war. So we stupidly offered these tanks, I think, because our Prime Minister at the time wanted the headline and to be seen to be doing something. But 6 months later, those tanks are still in Australia. You want to know why? Because the Australian government cannot figure out how to ship them. We can't get a couple of dozen tanks and the associated paraphernalia and put in place the right training regimes just to send some tanks to Ukraine. That's how bad we are at projecting power. The US, on the other hand, can unload battalions of tanks and helicopters and aircraft and all kinds of things and fight full scale wars on the other side of the planet, and they can do it with merely a few weeks' notice. No one else is capable of that. So it's not just about the defense spending, it's about what that spending has actually bought. America has a unique warfighting capability that makes it able to fight a war against China, able to fight a war against Russia, in a way that NATO, or the rest of NATO, excluding the US, is simply not equipped to do. Even though their defense spending may be more than Russia's, that doesn't make them comparable to the United States. And now they're revealing the fact that they know it. Because UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, when he came out with his statement, boots on the ground, planes in the air, which the media incorrectly reported as being a threat to send UK troops into the war. That's not what he said. What he said was, after a peace deal has been negotiated, the UK would like to lead a coalition of the willing to then send in peacekeeping forces, which would include UK boots on the ground and UK planes in the air. But after he made that statement, he finished it off saying, none of this is possible unless it has American support. That is at least a accurate admission on the part of the UK Prime Minister. Nothing is possible with Russia without US support. And this is the UK Prime Minister acknowledging this fact after Russia have been heavily depleted by their combat in Ukraine. There is no hiding from the fact that the war in Ukraine has been a terrible waste of human life and economic power and materiel, tanks and ammunition and everything else. Not that that really matters compared to the human life. But nevertheless, this has been a meat grinder and a machinery grinder. Enormous amounts of equipment, tanks and aircraft and helicopters and everything else have been destroyed in this war. And even with that terrible attrition, even with the terrible loss of human life, NATO without the US are still not equipped to take on Russia. Because the problem here is deeper than just spending, and it's deeper than hardware and interoperability and materiel. Because actually, at an individual human level, we Western, spoiled Westerners that have lived for 80 years under the umbrella of the Pax Americana, we are not ready for the realities of war. Think about it. Let's say Germany and the UK and France and some other countries put together a coalition and sent them into combat in Ukraine. What if Australia stupidly joined in? Maybe Canada as well. How many of our citizens, of our servicemen and women, would have to be killed in combat before the people of these countries would lose their stomach for the fight? I put it to you, it would be perhaps only a few dozen or a few hundred. Once newspapers start opening up with a fold full of the names and the faces and the birth years of the people killed in combat, and it starts to become multiple rows and multiple columns, and those birth years, by the way, are mostly going to start with a 2. These are going to be people mostly born in the 2000s plus. Sorry for those of us born in the 1900s. I didn't mean to make you feel old, but these will be 25-year-olds and younger being killed in the meat grinder of Ukraine. Do you really believe that we, the people, have the stomach for that reality? How many photos would have to show up in newspapers before we said, oh, hold on, guys, do we really need to be in this war? Is this really our war? Should we really be over there? It would take very, very little time before we would start asking the questions that we should have asked in advance. But here's the thing, hundreds of casualties happen every day in the Ukraine war. Honestly, if Western countries got involved in the Ukraine war, it would take about a day's worth of casualties to make them question the wisdom of that decision. And after a week's worth of casualties, they would be bailing as fast as they could. Not because the individual soldiers on the front lines are cowards, but because the population back home does not have the stomach for that fight. And honestly, nor should we. Not for that fight. That is not our fight. We shouldn't be sending troops halfway around the world to go and have yet another proxy war on the continent. But even so, even if that were a justified fight, think about it. Do we, the people back home, have the stomach for it? It would be a matter of days or weeks before we would be noping our way right back out of there and leaving Ukraine in a worse situation than it was, simply because the people back home don't have the stomach for the fight. And the politicians will start very quickly worrying about their electoral prospects once those newspaper articles and those photographs start appearing. Russia, on the other hand, well, they don't have that problem. They don't really worry about human life. We saw that in the way that they defeated the Germans on the Eastern Front in World War II. They literally just threw millions upon millions of warm bodies into a meat grinder until eventually they wore down and outlasted the Germans and began to push them back. That's not to take away any acts of individual courage on the part of the Russians, but at a strategic level, this was just about body weight. They were throwing warm bodies into the meat grinder, and it was horrific. But that cultural philosophy, that cultural belief in sacrifice for the motherland, well, that still exists in Russia, and by the way, in Ukraine as well. That's why, broadly speaking, putting aside the obvious issues around conscription and things that are happening on both sides, broadly speaking, they are able to throw vast numbers of bodies into these meat grinders and have their names and photos published in newspapers back home. And yet the war continues. The public support broadly continues, or at least if they've lost public support, people just kind of grumble about it. They don't really do anything. They're not. These are autocratic dictators, both Putin and Zelensky, now having cancelled elections and gotten rid of opposition parties and taken over the media, etc. They're not that worried about facing the ire of their people, and so they can keep throwing meat into the grinder. Western countries can't do that. Now, that on the one hand is a military weakness, but I'd say it's actually a cultural strength. If we are going to end lives and send lives into a meat grinder, we want to know that it's for a good cause. That's a good trait for us to have culturally, but it does put us at a disadvantage in a moment like this. What we've proved is that we, the West, have stomach for a fight as long as we're paying for the ammunition for people that we kind of like to shoot at people that we don't like. As long as our people aren't in the firing line, well, we'll supply you with the weapons, we'll supply you with the money, we'll send in people to maybe train you. But look, we're not going to get too heavily involved. Now, of course, Afghanistan and Iraq were exceptions to that. American troops and indeed many Australian troops were involved over there. And again, I'm not questioning the courage at the individual level of those warfighters. But honestly, why? Why were we there? I think that's a fair question to ask, especially given the way the withdrawal out of Afghanistan was completely botched. And the whole country is now owned and run by the very enemy that we spent 20 years, thousands of lives, and enormous sums of money trying to stop. I think that's a valid question to ask. And so when someone like Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, says we're going to support a peacekeeping mission to Ukraine, why? How is this our war? Have we learned the lessons that are staring us in the face from the many self inflicted military failures that we've had? Because, quite frankly, we're not willing to sell lives cheap the way that our opponents oftentimes are. And yeah, that's a military disadvantage, but it's a disadvantage I'm not willing to lose because I believe it's a cultural advantage. I believe valuing human life is a good thing and it's something we must not lose. But if we keep entangling ourselves in these foreign conflicts, we're going to start to lose that value on human life and become like the very people that we say we're trying to oppose. Here's the reality. If NATO or the EU put boots on the ground in Ukraine during the war rather than as a peacekeeping force, if they actually try and get directly militarily involved, they will nope their way out of there within weeks or months, and Russia will conquer them without ever having to invade Europe itself, simply by the self inflicted humiliation of the EU and NATO without the US in the Ukraine. They will become a cowed and defeated people. It would be a terrible, self inflicted strategic blunder for them to get directly involved in a hot war in Ukraine. But also, they're never going to get involved in peacekeeping in Ukraine because Putin is never going to end the war on terms that contemplate European troops inside Ukraine. Remember, Putin's red line through all of this has been that Ukraine will never join NATO. NATO have foolishly said yes, it will, despite the promises made in the early 90s that NATO would never move an inch eastward, something that they have broken many times since. So for Putin to end the war, a war that he started on the basis that he doesn't want Ukraine to become NATO, but to end it on terms that allow NATO troops into Ukraine, is unthinkable. He's never going to agree to that. So all this talk from Keir Starmer and from the Australian Prime Minister and from others saying, well, we'll put together a coalition of the willing to go and do peacekeeping work in Ukraine once the peace has been negotiated. Bullshit. Absolute nonsense. And the fact that they think that there's even a conversation to be had indicates they are either completely out of their depth or they see political advantage in lying to a population that is, for the most part, completely out of its depth because it spends its time watching mainstream media. The simple fact is, NATO cannot take on Russia in Ukraine, not in a war and not even in a peacekeeping capacity. But the good news is, I think that actually NATO leaders and EU leaders actually understand this. They may try to pretend differently in public, but I think that mask very quickly crumbles and the reality is shining through even as we speak. They know that they can't do this without the US, and that means that they won't, and that's a very good thing. But there are four key takeaways that I think we need to take out of this completely ridiculous situation. The first is that the US is right. Trump is right. Ukraine needs to negotiate a peace with Russia while the US is still involved. Because if the US pulls out while the fighting is still going on, Ukraine is going to end up in a far worse situation than it is right now. And Zelensky tried to fuck around. He tried to say, well, I'll sign this minerals deal with you only if you give me extra security guarantees that were not a part of the originally negotiated deal. Now, you remember that White House confrontation where Trump and Vance have been accused of bullying Zelensky. The fact is, it was Zelensky who wanted the media there. And he wanted the media there because he thought that would give him leverage, because he thought that Trump and Vance would have to agree to whatever he put forward. And then he ambushed them in that meeting, asking them, or in fact demanding from them, security guarantees that were not a part of the originally negotiated deal. Zelensky thought the media were going to make him the winner. Instead, the media being present made him the spectacular loser in that situation. And just 2 days later, he's had to come crawling back with his tail between his legs and offer to sign the minerals deal because the US, Trump, well, you don't mess with him. He said, you know what? We're just going to end our support for Ukraine. We're ending military aid effective immediately. You're on your own, buddy. And Zelensky comes crawling back immediately. Oh, I'm sorry. Please continue the military aid. Because he knows that if he has to negotiate with Putin without the US there, then he's screwed. And there probably won't be a Ukraine within a couple of months. Because why would Putin negotiate at all? If the US funding pulls out, Putin knows he can win this war. He can conquer the whole of Ukraine. So Zelensky's had to come crawling back to the US because Trump was right. Zelensky needs to sign that deal. Zelensky needs to negotiate a peace whilst the US is still involved. And then the US will be able to pull out and the war will be able to be over. Point two, the EU and NATO have been caught with their pants down. The US have been saying for a long time, and President Trump 1.0 said to the EU and to NATO when he was president, you've got to boost your spending. We can't keep spending our money to defend you and to defend Europe. And he was absolutely right. And this turn of events here with Ukraine has shown just how naked the EU are and NATO are without the US. They need to pay attention to this problem, otherwise they are going to get caught with their pants down in a situation where the US won't want to get involved, either because they don't want to, or because they're already heavily involved in a confrontation with China or some other place. So the EU need to take this as a wake-up call to get their own house in order. Point three, Australia needs to stop pretending that we are some significant geopolitical player. We are not. What is the Australian Prime Minister doing, bragging about the 1 point something billion worth of aid we've sent to Ukraine, which is not even a drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of this particular war? Why are we promising to send a couple of dozen tanks halfway around the world, something that we're not even logistically capable of doing, and something which will have dubious utility to Ukraine given the training issues I detailed earlier? Why are we making these promises? Why are we trying to inject ourselves into conflicts and geopolitical situations that simply are not ours? We need to learn to pull our heads in and turn our attention back to our own backyard and our own domestic defense capabilities because they are sorely lacking, and we should not be making promises that we can't even keep to foreign countries on the other side of the globe. And point four, the Western world needs to wake up to the fact that we are desperately, culturally unprepared for anything resembling a large-scale war. We do not have the stomach. We do not have the backbone. And as funny as it is to laugh about rainbow electric tanks, the reality is there is a cultural rot that has set in throughout the West, Europe being probably the worst, but Australia not being much better. that has undermined our stomach for a fight, that has undermined our capacity to be effective in a fight, and the willingness of the population to sustain the casualties and the hardships that would come with any kind of a war. Now, yes, it would be different if the mainland of Australia were attacked. I've no doubt about that. But that wouldn't happen until after a bunch of other conflicts have happened on our doorstep. China perhaps expanding into other countries first before coming for Australia. I think that's an unlikely scenario in any case. I really don't think the Australian mainland is under a great deal of threat, certainly not in the next decade or two. But the fact is, most of the wars we're going to fight are not going to be on Australian soil, and I don't think we have the stomach for a fight that isn't a genuine homeland defence type of fight. And we need to ask ourselves whether that's a good thing or whether it's not. Because generations past were willing to send troops halfway around the world into some of the, well, what were at the time the bloodiest theatres of combat in human history, in order to defend ideas, in order to defend their belief in freedom, the idea that the Australian way of life was worth defending, even if it had to be defended halfway around the world. Now, we're not willing to do any of that. And I would actually argue that's not because there's a problem with us, so much as it's because there's a problem with those ideals. We no longer uphold the freedoms that we say we fight for. And therefore, what are we fighting for? Is it worth fighting for? Is it worth sacrificing anything for nothing? What is it that we're fighting for? And that's what we've got to recapture. What it means to be Australian, what it means to be free. And I would suggest that until we can figure that out, we should be staying well away from any conflicts anywhere in the world. My name's Topher Field. This is the Topher Project, and I help people like you to understand the world as it changes around us. If you've learned something from this video, please give me a like, give me a follow, give me a share, maybe a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.